September 2016, the influential blogger and commentator Andrew Sullivan wrote a 7,000-word essay for New York Magazine titled, "I Used to Be a Human Being." Its subtitle was alarming. An endless bombardment of news and gossip and images has rendered us manic information addicts. It broke me. It might break you too. The article was widely shared. I'll admit, however, that when I first read it, I didn't fully comprehend Sullivan's warning. I'm one of the few members of my generation to never have a social media account and tend not to spend much time web surfing. As a result, my phone plays a relatively minor role in my life, a fact that places me outside the mainstream experience this article addressed. In other words, I knew that the innovations of the internet age were playing an increasingly intrusive role in many people's lives, but I didn't have a visceral understanding of what this meant. That is, until everything changed. In early 2016, I published a title called Deep Work. And as many people came and spoke to me about it, they talked about the power of the internet, recognized that it can and should be a force that improved their lives. They didn't necessarily want to give up Google Maps or abandon Instagram, but they also felt as though their current relationship with technology was unsustainable, to the point that if something didn't change, soon they'd break too. A common term I heard in these conversations about modern digital life was exhaustion. And that is an excerpt from Cal Newport's book called Digital Minimalism. And welcome to episode 5 of the Good Reads podcast. And today I'm going to go over Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism. And this is all about the relationship of technology in our lives. And it is a powerful, powerful book. And I hope that this is really, really helpful to you. And in the book, his whole goal is to present a philosophy of technology use. When you think about your own life and I think about my life, we have all kinds of philosophies that guide us. You might have a philosophy of money, how you manage, how you save, how you budget. You might have a philosophy of parenting, how you raise your kids, why you do the things that you do. Many of us have a philosophy of business or leadership. And what that means is we've thought about our relationship to these different roles or things that we do in life. But what he says with technology, we've never probably taken the time to craft a philosophy of what technology is going to look like in our life, how we're going to use it, what the limitations are, all that kind of thing. So that's what this book is all about. He says this, "In my work on this topic, I've become convinced that what you need instead is a full-fledged philosophy of technology use, rooted in your deep values, that provides clear answers to the questions of what tools you should use, how you should use them, and equally important, enables you to confidently ignore everything else." So again, what he's saying is that we need to think about the role of technology in our lives. We need to be intentional about it because otherwise technology ends up running us. And all of us, I think maybe many of us, if we're honest, we would say we probably have a bit of an unhealthy relationship with technology. And I would just encourage you as you're listening to right now, if you have an iPhone, take out your iPhone and just look what your average screen time is over the last 7 days. I looked at mine, it was 3 hours and 30 minutes. So what that's saying is that on average for the last 7 days, I spent 3 hours and 30 minutes on my iPhone. That seems crazy to me. I'm not proud of that number. And I would just challenge you to look and see what your number is. And when I first started monitoring my screen time, I was really amazed at how much time I was spending on it. And again, it just goes to say is that I feel like I'm a great recipient for Cal Newport's work because I want to redefine my relationship with technology. In his book, he quotes Lawrence Scott, who's a researcher in these things. They say that in this modern hyper-connected existence, a moment can feel strangely flat if it exists solely in itself. A moment can feel strangely flat if it exists solely in itself. And what Lawrence Scott is saying is that we're so used to always having music on, to always listening to something, to always having some kind of stimulation that we've just It's weird when there's no sound, when there's silence, when there's solitude, when we're not being entertained all the time. And I don't think that is a good thing. In the beginning of the book, what Cal Newport really does is he makes a case about how invasive technology is. And I'm going to share a lot of quotes on this because I think these are very, very compelling. He's going to use some strong language and strong arguments, but I want you to have an open-mindedness to these because he's not anti-technology, but he's just trying to present the case about how much we need a philosophy and a strategy to guide us in our relationship to it. He quotes Bill Maher, an episode from one of his shows, and Bill Maher was saying, the tycoons of social media have to stop pretending that they're friendly nerd gods building a better world and admit they're tobacco farmers in t-shirts selling an addictive product to children. Because let's face it, checking your likes is the new smoking. So I know that sounds really intense, but I think he's right. What he's saying is that technology is not neutral, but it is vying for your attention, and it is working and making money off of your attention span. And for many of those listening, if you've watched the show on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, I've not watched it, but a lot of people have told me about it. And when they tell me about it, it mirrors much of what's in digital minimalism. In fact, I kind of wonder if maybe whoever produced that used this book for some of their research. And I know that's a lot of the argument of The Social Dilemma, at least from what I've been told. But it's this whole idea about the addictive nature and the manipulative nature of social media and technology in our lives. He quotes Tristan Harris, who was a Google whistleblower. He was an engineer at Google. And as he worked there, he began to be concerned about how technology was being used. And he had an experience at the Burning Man Festival, if you've ever heard of that. Sounds like a very interesting ordeal. But he began to write against the invasiveness of technology and eventually create a nonprofit whose whole aim is to see how we can make technology serve us and not just be a means of advertising to us. But anyways, Cal Newport quotes him as saying this. He said, there's always this narrative that technology is neutral, right? It's not good or bad. It's neutral. It's up to us to choose how we use it. He says, this is just not true. It's not neutral. They want to use it in particular ways for long periods of time because that's how they make their money. So again, it's just being aware of this. Another Bill Maher quote, he said, Philip Morris, the cigarette company, just wanted your lungs. The App Store wants your soul. Tristan Harris again, he said that these tech companies, it's an arms race, but he says it's a race to the bottom of the brain cell. In other words, who can make technology that is going to tap into the human brain, captivate your attention in the most powerful and pervasive ways? That's what's going on. That's what they're working on. Another researcher, Adam Alter, who's from Princeton, he's a social psychologist. As he began to do some work in this area, he asked this question, what's the single biggest factor shaping our lives today? And he said, the conclusion I came to was our screens. And when I first read that, that really hit me. What is shaping us most as people? And it is our screens. It is our cell phones. We're with these things all the time. We're constantly looking to them, or our iPads or whatever, but it's that same basic principle. These are the most influential things in our lives by which we are constantly being influenced. In the same chapter, Cal Newport defines addiction. He says, addiction is a condition in which a person engages in use of a substance or in a behavior for which the rewarding effect provides a compelling incentive to repeatedly pursue the behavior despite detrimental consequences. So we'll keep engaging. And I think for many of us, that is our relationship with technology, that we're overly engaged with it. We recognize it has detrimental effects. It affects conversation. It affects our ability to concentrate. It affects our well-being. it affects all kinds of things in us in negative ways, but yet we just keep going back to it again and again and again. And so Newport's point in this chapter is just to build the case of why we really need to take this serious, and we need a philosophy for what tech use looks like in our life. And so digital minimalism is the philosophy that he's advocating. And now he's going to begin to explain it. And I love how he explains it. He begins by making a contrast between a minimalist philosophy and a maximalist philosophy. And I thought this was so incredibly helpful. He says, to a minimalist, it's a mindset, to a maximalist, it's a mindset in which any potential for benefit is enough to start using a technology that catches your attention. And hopefully I can explain this well, but this struck me when I read that many times we look at technology and we say, if there is any benefit at all, then it's worth using that technology. If there's any benefit this new app can get that I can get from on my phone, it might be a very, very marginal benefit, then in my mind, I justify it as worth incorporating at some level into my life. But he says, but that's not the way a digital minimalist thinks. It says, put another way, minimalists don't mind missing out on small things. What worries them much more is diminishing the large things they already know for sure make a good life good. So yes, maybe this app on my phone does give me a small benefit, but maybe it also feeds my addiction to social media. It feeds my addiction to tech. So the small benefit that I'm getting is far outweighed by the negative incurment of attention loss, or one more thing to consume my attention, or whatever. And that just perspective was really, really powerful to me, because I've been that way. Right? I think, if there's any benefit at all, then it's worth it. But that's not necessarily true, nor is that a good way to approach technology. So he begins to lay out some principles of digital minimalism. And here's principle 1. Clutter is costly. Digital minimalists recognize that cluttering their time and attention with too many devices, apps, and services creates an overall negative cost that can swamp the small benefits that each individual item provides in isolation. So again, the hours of screen time, because all the different apps that we're saying, I have it because it's helpful, but that's taking away way bigger things and way more qualitative things from our life. Under principle 1, he quotes Henry David Thoreau, who was part of the Transcendental movement in New England in the 1800s. But Thoreau wrote a book called Walden, and there is a pond called Walden. And what he did was he went and he built a home, and he tried to live really intentionally. So this is the 1800s. So this is before all tech. But even during that time, he realized how distracting life could be. And so he was trying to intentionally create a life that was far more intentional, engaged, that was healthier, that wasn't wasted in all the distractions of life. You know, he built this very simple cabin. I've actually went there years ago. It was a really cool experience. And maybe sometime I'll do that book. It's not an incredibly interesting book, but maybe I'll do a short one on it. But anyways, here's a quote from Thoreau. He said, "The cost of a thing is the amount of what I will call life, which is required to be exchanged for it, immediately or in the long run. The cost of the thing is the amount of what I will call life, which is required to be exchanged for it, immediately or in the long run." And I read that, I thought, how much life have we given up because we're scrolling mindlessly on our phones, right? How much of the real meaningful moments of life could have been had, the conversations, just being present with our families, with our spouse, with our kids, being present with God. How much more life could we have had if we had a different relationship with technology? I think we're missing out on a lot. I think personally that's true. I think a lot of the people that I'm around, that are part of our church family and all that, I think many would probably agree with that as well. So that's principle 1. Clutter is costly. We have to declutter technologically speaking. Secondly, optimization is important. So we want to use technology for us. We want to optimize it. And he talks a lot in that part about the law of diminishing returns. And what that means is that there's only so much return you get from something. And sometimes you hit this moment where the more effort you put into it, you're not going to get any greater of a return from it. So what that means is I have to look at technology and just say, what's a healthy return with the least amount of effort, begin to balance that out. And then principle 3, intentionality is satisfying. And so he's going to, again, argue for an intentional approach to technology. Because if you're like me, your approach to technology is not intentional, meaning you haven't really taken the time to say, why am I using it? How am I going to use it? What's the limitations of it? And what value is it adding to my life? And is that value in accordance with my real life value and goals and ambitions? If you're like me, you haven't really thought through that. You've just been more reactive and more passive to your relationship with technology. That's why I think this book is so helpful. He says in intentionality is satisfying, that intention trumps convenience. In this section, he talks a lot about the Amish community. And he says that really they're not necessarily anti-technology, but what they are trying to do is be very intentional with how they allow technology to shape their lives, which maybe, again, we've been very unintentional about that. But he says intention trumps convenience. So if you minimize some technology, will it create some more inconvenience? It might, but that inconvenience might be completely worth it and lead to greater satisfaction. One of the people that he was talking to in the Amish community, they said that I'm controlling the role technology is allowed to play in my life. And I want to be able to authentically say that I'm controlling the role technology is allowed to play in my life. I'm not getting consumed in mindless scrolling, mindless web surfing. I'm not being distracted every 2 seconds by group texts and things like that. I want to be back in the driver's seat in my relationship with technology, and I hope maybe you do as well. So he lays out this 3-step process. It's pretty simple, but I think it's highly challenging. And here it is. Step number 1. If you want to begin to practice digital minimalism, here's how you can begin. Number 1, take a 30-day break from all optional technology. So every technology that, and you have to be shrewd about this, right? At the end of the day, when I think about my relationship to technology, there's really only a few things that I need to successfully perform my job and not get fired in the next 30 days. I have to email, which I don't spend a tremendous amount of time on email. I have to do some work on my computer, Microsoft Word, Excel, this podcast. But all of that, when I really begin to audit my life of technology, all that's pretty small. So that's the technology that I would keep during this 30 days. But what I would get rid of is social media, or maybe I would only use it. So for my purposes, I might use it Sunday morning on Facebook because we go Facebook Live, but I would just keep it within that window. But again, the point is anything that you can truly get rid of, you get rid of for this 30 days. You go on a detox. Then number 2, during these 30 days, you explore and discover new activities and behaviors. And he's going to spend a lot of time talking about what those can be and giving some great suggestions. So the rest of the podcast, I'm going to talk about these different practices that he advocates for. And then number 3, the last part of the process is after the 30 days, you reintroduce technology, but you determine, you're intentional about it now, you determine its value and how you will use it. So you actually have some parameters around it, and you're determining that if I'm going to reintroduce it, it's because it brings a certain type of value to my life. So that's a 3-step process. 30-day tech fast. 2, explore and discover new activities. I'm going to give you a bunch to explore. And then 3, you reintroduce it if you deem that is actually valuable to your life, but then you determine how you're going to use it. You don't just leave that up in the air to be determined in the moment. So now let's talk about some of these practices to introduce during this technology fast. So the first one he talks about is spending time alone. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this because Cal Newport has another book called Deep Work, and he goes really, really deep into silence and solitude, and I'm going to cover that book soon, so I'm going to kind of save the alone time for that. But I will tell you one story from this section. He talks about Martin Luther King Jr. in 1956 when he was in the heat of the Montgomery bus boycott, had just come out of jail when he was arrested, and just was exhausted spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally, every way. And he knew he needed some alone time with God. So he's sitting late at night at his kitchen table, drinking a cup of coffee and just saying, God, I don't know how I can do this. And the house was absolutely quiet. And he was alone, no distraction. Coretta, his kids, they were all sleeping. And he said this powerful breakthrough moment happened. He said, it seemed at the moment I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth. And one biographer of his, Dave Gurrow, says that was the defining moment in his life. But it never would have came except if he was in solitude, except if he was alone and he could quiet himself and begin to hear from God. And I think so many of us, maybe our life, the clarity that we need, the encouragement that we need, the decisiveness that we need, maybe it's actually some time alone that we really need without our phone, without inputs, in quiet and in solitude. He talks about solitude deprivation. I just thought there were some interesting things about this. He says, whereas the iPod provided for the first time the ability to be continuously distracted from your own mind. So never has it been easier in our world to have absolutely no solitude, right? When we're in our car, when we're doing anything, we can and if you look at, younger generations, it's almost rare to see them walking without earbuds in of some kind. And I'm kind of guilty of that too. I listen to podcasts all the time in the car. If I'm working out, I'm listening to something. But what we're doing is we never have to sit and be with ourselves, which I think is incredibly important to a healthy soul. So he calls that solitude deprivation. There's this app, it's called Moment, and it helps you to track your screen time. And so people who sign up for this app, their average screen time is 3 hours. Now, keep in mind, these are people who are looking to be better about this, right? They actually care about it. So if their average daily screen time is 3 hours, how much average daily screen time is someone who's not even tracking it or care enough to put that app on their phone? So I think that's interesting. Solitude deprivation, he says, is a state in which you spend close to zero time alone with your own thoughts and free from the input of other minds. There is a powerful psalm in the Old Testament, but it says, be still and know that I am God. And that there is just something powerful. There's something deeply spiritual in solitude and in aloneness. And we need it in our life. A study by Common Sense Media from 2015 found that teenagers, and listen to this, spend an average of 9 hours per day in screen time. 9 hours per day. And then right after that, Cal Newport talked about one of the universities that he's part of and talking to their mental health professionals there, and they just said the rise of anxiety in college students is astronomical. And that's true in terms of teen suicide, teen anxiety. All of it is astronomically high. It's on the rise. And, I know correlation does not always mean causation, but it would seem to me that the correlation of screen time, tech use, how high it is, has to directly connect to rising levels of anxiety and things like that. So another practice that he advocates for is to leave your phone at home. And I know I just gave a ton of people anxiety by saying that. How could I leave my phone at home? Oh my gosh, what if there's an emergency? What if I get lost? And when he talks about this, he is old enough that he had a portion of his life before cell phones. I didn't have a cell phone until I was 18, so I do remember life before that, where you got to memorize your best friend's phone number, and there were message machines, and when you were driving, I remember having to pull over because I'm terrible at directions, and ask people how to get places. And, and I know those are the big things that tend to make us convince ourselves we need our phone on us all the time. Like you need your head on your shoulders. But he says, but what you really realize, and he says, what I want to emphasize is that most of the improvement from having your phone with you is minor. Put another way, in 90% of your daily life, the presence of a cell phone either doesn't make or make things only slightly more convenient. So his point is that you can leave your phone at home and it's going to be okay. Life's going to go on. And in fact, you might even be better because you're taking back control of the role of technology in your life. I've not tried that yet, but I am motivated to try that. I'm going to start trying that, leaving it at home, because like probably many of you, it does feel like it's an extra appendage on my body, and I want to break that. I don't think that's good. So another practice that he says is take long walks, which I do that on occasion and do find that highly valuable. He quotes Friedrich Nietzsche, the German existential philosopher. I'm not a huge fan of him, but I do have to acknowledge that he has shaped the world's thinking through his writings. So Nietzsche said, only thoughts reached by walking have value. And he was notorious for spending a lot of his time and doing a lot of his thinking walking. There's a great American theologian named Jonathan Edwards, who I think is one of the most brilliant theologians who ever lived. And he was notorious for doing a lot of his deep thinking on horseback. So a little bit different, but similar kind of idea. You're out in nature, your body's being occupied, and your mind is able to free to think about deep and important things. So take long walks. So again, these practices are things to do where we would normally be mindlessly or in an unhealthy way engaged in screens, social media, technology, Netflix, whatever. He then goes in specifically to really dig into some social media in a chapter called Don't Click Like. He cites some studies that NPR had popularized on social media, and it said both studies found strong correlations between social media use and a range of negative factors, from perceived isolation to poor physical health. So in other words, the more time on social media, the more time you spend on social media, the more negatively it impacts the quality of your life. It says the more you use social media to interact with your network, so the more that you use it as a means to connect with people, the less time you devote to offline communication. So the more I'm communicating with people through Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, texting, whatever, pick your poison there, the less time I'm actually talking to people, actually having conversation. I'm actually having, physically present or audible styles of communication. He quotes Sherry Turkle, who has studied a lot about this, and she talks about the difference between connection and conversation. She says connection is what we get online, but it's not really conversation. And text isn't really conversation either. She says face-to-face conversation is the most human and humanizing thing we do. Fully present to one another. We learn to listen. It's where we develop the capacity for empathy. It's where we experience the joy of being heard, of being understood. And so much of technology is working against face-to-face conversation actually happening. And she says, I'm not anti-technology. I love what she says. She says, I'm just pro-conversation. And I feel that same way. I'm not anti-technology. I love technology. I love podcasts. I love so much that technology has to offer. I love that as a church, we can reach more people than we ever could imagine through technology. So I'm all for it. Don't hear me being against technology, but I am even more for managing and being in control of my relationship with it, because I do believe that it is overcoming our lives in unhealthy ways. Then he spends some time on this practice, what he calls reclaiming leisure. And I loved this chapter. I thought it had some really, really good thoughts in it. He says, to resonate with our understanding of human nature today, a life well lived require activities that serve no other purpose than the satisfaction that the activity itself generates. In other words, all of us need things in our lives that don't have a pragmatic purpose other than they give us joy. You know, like for me, I love being on Lake Erie, whether it's boating or, you know, there's no pragmatic purpose to boating. In fact, it's just going to cost you a lot of money and headaches. But I love being on the water. It fills my soul. And these are kind of leisure activities that he's talking about. He says, in recent years, as the boundary between work and life blends, jobs become more and more demanding and community traditions degrade, more people are failing to cultivate the high quality leisure. So we're getting worse as that as a community. And you can read all kinds of research on learning and stuff that talks about how having activities that feel like play to us engage the mind, they foster better relationships, they create, open up neural pathways in our mind to be able to learn better. Just all these great things. And I know maybe sometimes we feel guilty about leisure. We feel like it can't be prioritized because there's all these other things. But his point is if we're spending 3.5 hours a day on our phones, then there is time to create some habits and some practices in our life in that 3.5 hours that can actually provide a greater sense of well-being. He talks about the financially independent community, sometimes called the FIRE community, and it's people that are in their 20s and 30s. And the basic idea of this community is that they're trying to save half of their income every year so that they can retire early, long before their 60s, and have a lot more time to use it how they want. And as he was talking with some from this community, he said that they often voluntarily fill their open hours with strenuous activity. He said this bias toward action over more traditional ideas of relaxation might strike some as needlessly exhausting, but it makes perfect sense. And so what he's going to talk about now, which I think is dead on, is that in our leisure time, we need to do activities that are strenuous. Not in the traditionally relaxing sense where I'm just going to throw my feet up and binge, watch TV, or kind of do nothing. Because at the end of the day, those are not actually renewing to the human body, mind, or soul. He says expending more energy in your leisure can end up energizing you more. Right? I always convince myself, you just need to relax and do nothing. But relaxing and doing nothing de-energizes me. It makes me less capable. It makes me less happy, honestly. But when I'm actually doing something that is enjoyable but strenuous, but stretching, that's what really refills me. And I don't think I'm actually unique in that. I think that's how most of us are. He says prioritize demanding activity over passive consumption. Let me read that again. I think that's so good. Prioritize demanding activity over passive consumption. And then he talks about ways to do that. He says use skills to produce valuable things in the physical world. So maybe get into woodworking or, working on your car yourself, or gardening, or, painting or whatever. But try to do something that's going to develop a new skill in you, and it's going to produce something valuable in the physical world. He says seek activities that require real world, structured social interactions. I think that's one of the reasons why CrossFit has just swept over our world, because it's strenuous, but it's also social. So people are doing something that they're proud of, right? I've done some quasi CrossFit workouts. They're hard, man. It's tough. They whoop you, but you're proud of yourself after you're done. And then in those environments, since they're always group oriented, you are creating social interaction. And again, that builds our lives in a good way. He says, here's another practice: fix or build something every week. Use some of that extra time where you might be on social media, be on Netflix, be on YouTube. Go fix something. Work with your hands. It can be tremendously fulfilling. And then he says to schedule your low quality leisure in advance. So I like watching a good Netflix show just like everybody else. But he says, all right, well, if you're going to do that, then schedule it. Just say, all right, Friday night from 6 to 9, I'm going to just binge watch whatever I want. But again, it's just taking back control. Or hey, Thursday night from 8 to 9, I'm going to just let myself scroll through Instagram. And we're putting limits, we're putting barriers, we're being intentional with how we use it. He sums it up. He says, strategize your free time. And then he ends this section this way. Finally, in justifying this planning approach, I want to underscore the foundational argument delivered throughout this chapter. Doing nothing is overrated. It's overrated. It's not fulfilling. It's not meaningful. So anyway, those are some thoughts from Cal Newport's Digital Minimalism. There's a lot more detail in the book, and I would encourage you to check it out for yourself and read it. But I hope that's helpful to you, and I just want to encourage you. I'm going to be on this journey with you. Let's reclaim the place of technology in our lives. Let's move out of the passenger seat and into the driver's seat. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will see you next week.